It's the early 70s, and Ford of Europe is trying to decide whether or not to build a car that would later become the Fiesta. Fiat had just released the 127, Renault was going to release the R5, and Ford didn't have a direct competitor. Both these cars became popular in Europe almost immediately. Ford had plans for a Mini, but they had them sitting on a shelf since 1969. The final push to get Ford motivated to build this car was the release of the Honda Civic into the European market. The Fiesta would become one of the most important cars to Ford of Europe. It ushered in front-wheel drive on a mass scale, not only in Europe, but also in America. And this is a car that was never intended for the American shores. How and why that happened, and the history of the Fiesta, is the topic of today's video. Founded in 1967, Ford of Europe began from a merger of Ford European manufacturing plants. The first vehicle they launched was the Escort in 1967 as a 1968 model. The Escort was a rear-wheel drive, small family car that was built in both Britain and from 1970 on in Germany. The Escort sold well, however it was not a competitor in the super mini market, and those cars did well in Spain and Italy, whereas Ford's Escort did not. The Mini, the Fiat 128, and the Simco 1100 all had shown that a front-wheel drive small car could do well in Europe, but as late as early 1972, the management at Ford of Europe still didn't want to build a Mini. They didn't feel it was cost prohibitive, and that a Ford Mini would only take away sales from the Escort. There were two people at Ford that were convinced Ford needed a Mini. Those two people were product development man Hal Sperlich and Lee Iacocca. So in the fall of 1972, those two got the go-ahead on developing Ford's Mini. The car was styled by Ghia's Tom Jarda. He was an American who also styled the Fiat 124 Spider, the Pantera, and the Ferrari 365, among others. This car had to be built to cost, as it had to be cheaper to make than the European Escort. So Ford's team used different product locations to minimize the cost of parts and assembly and reuse components where they could. Under the hood, the Fiesta used a reworked version of the Kent 4, which is now called the Valencia. All Fiestas would be built as a 3-door hatch and utilize a 4-speed manual transmission. Other cost-cutting measures included non-reclining seats as standard and very little optional equipment. Up front, the design used McPherson struts with a beam rear axle and a panhard rod. Released in 1976, the car was an immediate sales success in Europe. Just over the 2-year mark of assembly, Ford had built its 1 millionth Fiesta. Typically, this would be the end of the story, and this car would have not landed on my channel, since 75% of my audience lives in the U.S., and they wouldn't have an interest in this car. However, on December 22nd of 1975, President Ford signed the bipartisan passed Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, which established the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, or C.A.F.E. standard. These regulations would take effect in 1978. The Ford lineup of cars would need to average at least 18 miles per gallon in order to avoid penalties. To offset the larger cars in the lineup, think LTD here, Ford would need to sell something smaller and more fuel efficient than the Pinto.
Presenting the new Ford Fiesta. It goes from 0 to 50 in 9.1 seconds. It maneuvers like a born champion. It gets 43 miles to the gallon on the highway and 30 in town. Fiesta. See what the cheering's all about at your Southern California Ford dealer.
1977 sees the Fiesta arrive on U.S. soil. Ford would build the U.S. spec cars in Germany. They were equipped with a 65 horsepower, 1.6-liter cross-flow Kent engine. Available models were the Base, Decor, Sport, and Ghia, with the Ghia having the highest level of trim. These trim levels changed very little in the Fiesta's 3-year run in the U.S., from 77 to 1980. Really, there were no changes of note to the car during its 3-year run. Changes required for the U.S. market included a catalytic converter and air pump to satisfy emission regulations, 5-mile-per-hour energy-absorbing bumpers, side marker lights, round sealed beam headlamps, and Ford offered optional air conditioning, which was not available in the European version.
Ford Fiesta. Voted most significant new import by readers of Car and Driver. Fiesta. 0 to 50 in an average of 8.8 seconds. Road gripping Michelin radial tires. The traction of front-wheel drive, and excellent gasoline economy. Fiesta, imported from Germany by Ford. Test drive one for the fun of it at your authorized Ford Fiesta dealer.
In the U.S. market, it was truly a stopgap car, but it did well here. Ford moved more than 263,000 Fiestas in North America from 1977 until the fall of 1980. The U.S. Escort appeared on the scene in 1981, and with its arrival, the Fiesta was dropped from the U.S. lineup as it simply wasn't needed anymore. In Europe, the engineering done to create the U.S. Fiesta was reused in 1980 to offer the 1.3-liter Kent version of the car. The 1.6-liter followed months later as the XR2, which became the most famous and desirable version of the original European Fiestas. In 1983, the MK1 Fiesta was facelifted. It's now called the MK2. It remained on sale until the spring of 1989. Ford seriously considered building the Fiesta in the United States. However, Henry Ford II nixed that idea. I wanted to make this video because I often see in the comments section that I haven't seen one of those cars in X number of years, and X number of years is usually in decades. However, I see a Fiesta driving around my local town probably every other month. I don't know that they're daily driven, but they certainly aren't show cars. I'm wondering if any of you have a similar experience. There are very few cars that Ford's imported in the United States. There's been a few over the years. Like this one over here, it's on the first generation Mercury Capri. I go over the engine options and some of the models that came out with that car. So if you like this video, please click the like button. That way other people see it. That's how YouTube works. Also consider subscribing. There's a lot of similar content like this on the channel. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Until next time, we'll see you.